On the day Abigail Vance was supposed to become a wife, her groom vanished, her father turned away, and an outlaw handed her a horse instead of pity. What began as a ruined wedding became a journey across the unforgiving West, where one young woman discovered that freedom is not given, it is chosen. This is a story about courage, dignity, and the power of owning your own name. Stay until the end, and if this story touches your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to support the channel.
It just beat down on the New Mexico dirt, beat down on the New Mexico dirt, baking the timber of the small church until the pastry Abigail Vance stood be cracked looking glass, dress glissery Abby laced up before it cracked the dry goods, store heavy. It was made the cheapest unbleached working lace in the collar and cuffs. Her mother's hands had spent long months working the collars com stekra karlik and krokto to Kearney for the Florpali name, but she had sewn anyway, for dignity, for the family name. Abby looked at her reflection. She didn't see a woman, she saw a package, wrapped up, tied tight, and waiting on the counter to be collected. 2 years ago, her father had called her in his study. The gourmet advanced in stale tobacco. Pastor Harold Vance old leather look at his daughter. Pastor Mariella Diaz Boone, the boy Thaddeus Boone Abigail, he had said, his voice carrying the same heavy weight he used for Genesis. He is a man of mean, settled. Abby had asked why. In Dusk Creek, daughters of the cloth didn't ask questions. They said Aiken in the scare ain't singer. And the old organ in the sanctuary to groan, its bellows leaking air in the heat of Eastiel. The pews were full. The townsfolk to see the minister girl Bindhurst to the Wellies merchant in the valley. Abby walked to Double Door. Her father stood there, his black coat dusted with gray trail ash. He took her elbow. His grip was firm, a reminder of the law he preached. The doors groaned open. The heat from the nave hit her like an oven. But at the end of the aisle, the altar was empty. 5 minutes passed. The organist played the same verse twice, her fingers slipping on the keys. 10 minutes. The whisper began, low and dry, like locust in the corn. His face pale sweat from Boone's storks when his color, as leaned in Pastor Vance ear. Abby watched her fire soars at the gate of Father Jaw go slack. The pastor dropped his arm. The pastor dropped Abby's arm, but he spoke when the clerk did his one nice to the front pews. Boone took the night stage to Santa Fe. The ledger is gone. He ain't coming back. He didn't ask if Abby was hurt. He didn't offer a hand. Pastor Vance turned his back to his daughter to face his congregation, already fashioning a sermon to salvage his pride from the ruin. Abby didn't cry. Not there. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of a spectacle. Her boots clicking loud on pine floorboards, she walked past the vestry, out the heavy oak's back door, and kept walking until Durst where the town ended, and Hydra car. Then her knees cards. She gave out arm. Tin saturated the bar, her knuckles bunched upward. The white twist fall the dirt and netos haracus. Abius wadra hosfadkan was, had tears gnawed prayer, cow Cadius Boone, and that he had never loved him. He was oss. She had barely known the shape of his voice when he wasn't talking about prices. She cried because she was 18 years old, and for the first time in her life nobody was telling her what to do. The silence of the desert was terrifying. Without a master, she didn't know who she was. She had been a daughter, a prospect, a piece of property, but never just Abigail. The sound of iron on flint broke the quiet, a slow, steady walk. Abby choked back a sob and looked up through the dust. Her coat was mare stood on the trail, dusted with white Coca-Cola from the road. The man in the saddle didn't look like an angel. He wore a low, slung coat, a faded denim shirt, and a hat pulled low enough to cast his eyes in deep shadow. Silas West held his eyes the roots. Had des West End the one collected launched it. He didn't tip his hat. He just watched her, leavely walked gloriously. He was an outlaw. The territory had posters with his face yet. To him, a crying woman on a lone trundle and on a lonely trail was nothing but trouble and a delay he couldn't afford. Silas the lay over the saddle, then backed down at the dirt. Silent his leg over the saddle and dropped down. His boots hit the earth with a dull thud. He didn't offer her a hand to pull her up. He didn't think she needed to be treated like china. Har and placed the worn leather directly in Abby's dirt fingers. You need a horse or a gravel coat. It warms like roughs horse was leather in her palm. Her eyes read, tall second. She looked up all, but the hard lined his false a fraction. False cabal bond horse. The hard lined his for a long just second. Salas opened his car. She's called Midnight, took a fraction, turning his cart toward the West Hills. She bites folks she don't know, but she carry you fair if you've got the sand to ride her. He didn't wait for a thank you. He just turned his back on the town of Dusk Creek, adjusted his gun belt, and began to walk down the trail on foot. Abby stayed in the dirt for one more hype, the reins tight in her hand. The dress was ruined, but the horse was real. She pulled hers up, using the saddle for leverage, and looked toward the setting sun. Sometimes, a life has to fall completely apart before you can find the pieces that actually belong to you. Abby didn't ride away. She stood in the red dust of the trail, holding the warm leather reins of the black mare, and watched Silas Weston walk. He walked with a long, loose stride, the stride of a man who knew the distance between waterholes and didn't believe in wasting his breath. Her wedding boots were thin. They were made for standing still on a pine floor, not for the flint and cactus of the high chaparral. But she looked back once at the sharp wooden spire of the Dusk Creek Church. Then she looked ahead at the black hat moving away from her. She led the horse. She didn't mount. She just walked. Silas didn't stop, but he knew she was there. A man who lives with a bounty on his head hears everything. Hears the gravel shifting under a small heel. He hears the deep, rhythmic breathing of all folly beneath him. After a mile, there a brush, the heat, the gray brush, and the blue mountains 60 miles off, looking like clouds that had frozen mess solid. Silas stopped by a clump of stunted bake. He didn't turn around. He just spoke to the brush. Midnight don't like folks walking her, he said. His voice was flat. She's a riding animal. You're wasting her legs and you're wearing out your own. Abby caught up, her breath coming a little fast through her teeth. Her white hem was black with grease from the trail. I walk beside you, she said. Not behind you, and I won't ask you anything you don't want to answer. Silas turned his head then. The shadow of his brim cut right across his nose. He looked at her face, pale and streaked with dried salt from her crying. He looked at her hands. They were small, but she held the reins short, the way a person does when they aren't afraid of being bit. You're a minister's girl, Silas said. You talk like you're reading from a book. Out here the dirt are promises. I am not a mister's girl, Abby said. She didn't know where the words came from. They just felt true when they hit the air. Not today. A moment longer. The Mars sold of Santa Carrara turn into the trial. If he catches up, turning back to trail, I happen to argue your case on your sister. I've been on my own my whole life, she said. They walked to turn the color and hold the coin and drop an eye rim of the world and drop behind the rim and stay hot. The moment didn't stay hot. The desert didn't cold. Came down from the peaks, sharp and cold, smelling sod, dry sod. Silas found a spot. The goods quad, hid from south bar, hidden or bar, protected from the wind. He didn't ons Ab with help. A move with a quiet, efficient, that font comes from years of sleep on the ground. He struck a flint against Nightblade, catching the spark in nest of dry ors Nightway. Swag grass, the fire was small. No bigger than a man 2 hands, big fire are for fools, Silas said, crouching by the coals. They tell every thief within 20 swire to find a warm coat and a pocket watch. A small fire whore keeps you warm. A solid war sit close enough to her chest, trying to tuck the thin cotton dread from a hakel core star. The sparks. She watched him pull a strip of dried beef from his saddlebag. He divided with his knife. 1 piece for him, 1 piece for her. He handed across the smoke. Her fingers brushed his. His skin was rough, like the bark of a cedar tree. Most people can't shut up for 5 minutes, Silas said, chewing slowly. They dat wall like quiet. They think if they twa loose air, they think if they don't make noise they aren't there. Abby took a small bite of the meat. It was salt tough, making her jaw ache. Most people were never taught that their word matter, she said. In my father's house, was lollies was like Donatani. It made a sound. A woman's not changed their plan side. They learned to keep my thought inside. They don't get that way. Silas stopped chewing, almost. His gray eyes, the tiny flame, for the first time caught the yellow light. He looked this time, he didn't look through her. But thoughts kept too long in the dark sour. Before she could erect the sower. Girl, but milk left the cellar. Like milk left in the cellar. He connertsy. Prime. The hot water low wet with riz. The salt ridge gave a wet bluster always. Silas was on his feet before the sound cleared the horse's throat. He didn't naste was gun, hard and heavy. His hand closed over her shoulder, hard and heavy. Don't blink, The white you're low, he whispered against her hair. Don't lark. The white could zar at her heart had so. They lay in a cold dirt. Abby could steady thrum of his heart her. All the steady thrum of her hot shoulder blade. It was and racing. Wasn't, was slow and heavy. From the trail above came the jingle of iron bridle, the steady heavy tood, horses were sort of 6 horses, fast. Aids, heavy turrets the source, the riders were silhouettes against the stars. They rode slack, their hats tilted back, their coats flack, on the saddle of flapping. On the saddle of the leaden man, a silver horn cap caught the moonlight, a silver horn hub caught the moonlight. Flacco glides Logan Vance's men, Silas whispered when the sound had faded into the wash. He released her shoulder, but he didn't stand up. He stayed crouched in the dark. Abby sat up, rubbing her shoulder where his fingers had left an ache. Logan is my father's cousin, she said. He works for Thaddeus Boone. Why would Boone's men be riding hard after dark? Silas spat into the dust. Because your groom didn't run because he was tired of you, Abigail. The words felt like cold water. Boone? He owns the bank. He owns store. Silas' store. He snapped back down by the dying coals, his face dark. But he owed Logan Vance and the local syndicate more his warswakals off fate ward. Logan told him if through with the wedding, they bit wasn't a note. They'd take the store or the house or can walk off how I, cause they saw. They told him they'd use you, all security till the gold was paid. Abby stared at the black embers, the way Dwada could. A lien, she whispered. A mortgage on a dress, tis Silas said. Buanetrabe, he didn't want a brave man. Why, he didn't want to lose his ledger. He didn't want to see Logan take you out of the church to pay his debts. So he took the night stage. He ran to save his skin, but he left you behind so they wouldn't come after him first. The cold wind came through the wash, lifting the hem of her lace. It felt clean now. The dirt on it was honest dirt. So he ran to protect himself, she said, and protecting me was just something that happened by accident. Most safety out here is an accident, Silas said. People don't look out for you unless there's a percentage in it. That's still more than my father did, Abby said. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. My father knew Boone was drowning. He knew it 3 months ago. He just wanted me out of his house before the water rose above the porch. Silas didn't answer, and kicked dirt over the last of the fire, putting the world back in the dark. By the 3rd morning, the white dress was no longer white. It was the color of the country, a pale, dusty gray that blended into the sage. Abby had taken Silas' pocket knife while he was watering the horse and cut 6 inches off the hem. Her ankles were bare to the wind now, her shins scratched by the low cat claw, but she could move. She stood by Midnight's shoulder, holding a handful of dry bunch grass she had pulled from the shade of boulder. The mare looked at her. Her large liquid eye was suspicious. She blew a spray and foam on Abby's sleeve, her ears flat against her crown. She ain't a pet, Silas says from the bubs, cut his fingers black with tallow. You treat an animal like it a person, it treat you like a fool. A horse don't want your affection. Vance, I wants to know who walks the trail, Silas want your affectionin'. She said to Oswald the territory. Abby didn't move her hand. She stayed still, letting the smell her sins, smelling the salt and walk of the trail. She doesn't still want to be owned stan of faries. She just know if I'm going to drop the lead when the ground took the grass. Her rough lips tickled Abby's dry and warm. Silas came down's palm, dry locks tower, put her hand the breadsnick. Watched the girl hunt on the mares, while the brack hurned into thick ridge of moss. The slossel, you could aid are a touch flossing, or I would have scaled a bar about its back. Through his saddle blanket, old Granganstut. Soft get you buried out here. You keep saying that, Abby said, watching Tane the cinch. But you gave your horse. If you were as hard as that gun on our hip, you have left me to walk back to parsonage. You've left me to walk back to the parsonage. Silas pulled the leather strap tight, but grunted. It'n't give you leg, he said. I lend you a pair of legs. Gwin on a public road is bad for business. It brings people out to look, and don't like being looked at. Why? She asked. Because of papers. Silas stopped his hand. What papers? The ones at the station, I said. So past its hosty. I saw Wallace Elias. All by the water, Silas. My father made sure of that, if he didn't care what I did with the letters. Silas stood up straight. His face was unreadable. And what did the letters say? They said your name, she said. They said you took $3,000 from the First Federal Bank of Cimarron. They said you were a thief. The desert became very quiet. The only sound was the wind clicking through the dry seed pods of the yucca plants. Silas didn't reach for his holster, but his arm went stiff against his side. "You should have run," he said. "You should have stayed at that station and told the agent you were being held by an outlaw." Abby looked down at her hands, then back up at his gray eyes. "The agent was drunk," she said. "And his eyes were small. He looked like the kind of man who would sell a horse twice if the buyer wasn't looking. You haven't lied to me since we started walking. A thief who tells the truth is better company than a holy man with a secret in his pocket." Silas let out a short, dry sound that might have been a laugh if he remembered how to make one. "You're a strange girl, Abigail." "I am just hungry," she said. "Are you?" They ate their noon meal under the shadow of a red sandstone bluff that looked like a ship turned upside down. The wind was high, carrying the fine red sand that got into everything: their hair, their water, the lard they spread on their hardtack. "Why did you take it?" Abby asked. She didn't look at a hoaxer, a dead cedar on the ridge, the money in Samaran. Silas didn't answer for a long time. He took his hat off, saw it was sun the pull at his dark hair, without in the weight where the harl, but the rest of his face was burned the color of an ombre. His forehead was white where the hat protected. The paper said lie we bought pair of old boot. The boss thought was different now. It didn't have the hard edge, he crowed. He yawed the sorrow of the trail. That's what the clerks wrote down in their book. They like books. They like columns with lines tell you who owns the grass and who owns the water. Did you take it? "I took what belonged to the people who worked the ditch," Silas said. He leaned his head back against the red stone. "The bank wrote a contract for the irrigation layout. They used words that an old rancher named Hector couldn't read. Hector was blind in his left eye, and he couldn't see the tiny print at the bottom of the page. The print said if the river went dry for 3 weeks, the bank got the land, the cattle, and the house he built with his own axe." Abby turned her head. "The river always goes dry in August," she said. "That's what Sut knew, Silas. They wait until Bud cracked. Then they sent 3 men with rifles to put Hector on the road. He died too late in a wagon bed. No wet, no shoes." He looked down at his gloved hands. "I went into that vault on a Tuesday night," he said. "I didn't use a gun. I used a crowbar and 3 sticks of powder. I took exactly right $200, the price of 12 homesteads that the manager had crossed off his ledger. I didn't keep a nickel. I left the bags on the porches of the widows and the boys who were asleep in the brush." Abby Watt, his face says. "The law says that's a crime," she said. "The law was written by the man who owned the bank," Silas said. "He paid the judge's rent in Santa Fe." "You think that judge cares about an old man who can't read his own name?" Abby thought about her father's study. She thought about the heavy leather Bible that sat on the cedar table, and how her father used its pages to tell her she couldn't walk past the garden gate without his permission. "My father always told me the law was God's order in the wilderness," she said. "He said without it, we'd all be savages." "Your father's got a roof over his head," Silas said. "It's easy to believe in the law when the walls keep the rain off your bed. When you're sleeping in the ditch, the law looks like a pair of boots kicking you until you move along." He stood up and pulled his hat back down over his eyes, putting the shadow back where it belonged. "Come on," he said. "Midnight's rested. We've got 10 miles before we find a well that hasn't been poisoned by alkali, and the sun ain't waiting for us to finish our sermon." Abby rose, her short skirt catching on the flint. She didn't feel the scratches anymore. She reached for the reins, and this time when she led the black mare forward, she felt like she was walking toward something, rather than just running away from a church that had grown too small for her spirit. The high desert didn't have many roads, but it had plenty of eyes. A lone woman in a short, ragged wedding dress walking beside a man with a low, slung colt was a story that told itself to every buzzard and rider between Dusk Creek and the border. Silas knew it. He kept his eyes on the ridges, his hand never more than 2 inches from his walnut grip. They hit the flats near Apache Leap by mid-morning on the 5th day. The wind was low, but it carried the smell of old iron and wet leather. Silas stopped midnight with a flick of his wrist. He didn't look back at Abby. He just dropped his right hand down until his fingers touched his thigh. "We've got company," he said. His voice was lighter than the wind. "Don't turn your head. Don't touch your hair. Just keep your eyes on the mare's left ear." Abby stood still. Her boots had split gray with silt. She did exact what he said. He looked at Midnight's brack. It was pulled back stiff as a notched stick. A horseman rose out of the dry wash 30 yards ahead. Hyatt. He didn't come fast bit. He rode a buckskin with a split ear and a heavy spatus that jangled like loose hair. The rider was broad, wearing an old buffalo Hyde Blossered, that almost was hybrid. His name was Tucker. He worked track hoof for anyone with a gold piece and an eviction notice. Tucker stopped his horse in the middle of the trains, then it stayed flat on the horn of his saddle. Weston, Tark and against was there, Tucker said. He spat a dark stream of tobacco juice into the gray brush. Thought that was your mare's track back at the tank. You're riding slow for a man with a price on his head. Silas slow for a man with Ez didn't move. This sut feet apart. Move fast Keekens hot. Tucker, mooksen fast just gets a horse wind before the work's done. Tucker's and small greasy eyes tifted over Sutter's shoulder. They settle its holders. Taught the deedy, teen the color of old corn. They sort of look cars sput call those fardesks, or kin high. She looked right to the man's buffalo vest. Du kirkia, or dadas what fatuos, or chew on. Tuck said all leaning forwards. Safe and sound, he says. Wants her back in the parlor before the congregation starts asking where the collection plate went. $50 is a lot of bacon, Silas, more than you'll find in the rocks out here. Abby felt her stomach drop like a stone into a dry well. She didn't look at Silas, but her hand tightened on Midnight's halter until her knuckles went white. Silas didn't blink. His shadow lay long and straight behind him. I don't do missing persons, Tucker. Tuck chuckled. Dry sound like gravel shift in a pan. Since when? Since now, Silas said. His voice didn't rise. Cold as water, but it grew cold. Well. Right on, the buckskin looks like she about to drop a shoe. And Evie got a long way to go before I listened on who Silas' right hand. He looked the steady brack eye of the mare. Tucker, what's right new Silas? He knew $50 wasn't enough to pay for a hole in his chest. He pulled his buckskin around, his spurs clinking loud against the stirrups. You can't keep her hidden forever, West Tucker called back over his shoulder. The territory's small when a man's looking for his property. He rode off, his horse's hooves kicking up small puffs of white dust that hung in the stagnant air. The silence came back, heavier than before. Abby stood by the horse's flank, her chest heaving. She looked at Silas back. He hadn't moved an inch. How long have you known, she asked. Her voice to it now. An edge was quiet, but it had a stew it now, an edge she had learned the stone slow. Silas took us and wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve. Since the second day, a scout at the stage station told me, said a parson was offering $50 for his runaway girl. And you didn't take me back, she said. You didn't turn the horse around. No, Silas said. Why? Abby stepped closer to him, her ragged dress dragged through the cat claw. $50 would buy you a lot of cartridges. It would buy you a new saddle. Why did you keep walking? Silas looked down at his boots. Then he looked right at her. His gray eyes were flat, without any of the softness she had seen by the fire. Because $50 isn't worth much when you can't sleep through the night, Silas said. His words were short, said a heavy pause. I've seen men sell their sisters for less. I've seen fathers trade their boys to the timber camps for a head of cattle. The laws of father owns his house. Et en a car Israel edisar commander duakal. A boer erha faster aber de coins. A gotkan. A person could drate its hunted hang. The la first time Andy Force. Abby girl the Voss hay. Not alder not Vance. The bay Foss. Your father didn't want you back because he loved you. He want you back because an empty chair in his church looks like a sin. He can't explain the bishop. If I took you back for that money, I'd be no better than the men who put Hector on the road. Am a thief, Abby. But I ain't a slave catcher. He turned to the horse and the stirrup leather. Abby stayed where she was, her breath slowing down. Sly. The heat was still there, but the desert didn't look quite as wide or quite as lonely anymore. Do you think I was stupid? She asked after a mile of walking. For rotten the church. Silas didn't look back. I think you're the first whole miserable value did something because you chose to. Stupid is staying in a pen when the gate's left unlatched. Chaotic Kana grabisness I know a Plas said. Even sa, I don't know where I'm going. They just buy a spawad Sayad a plaids forads by a people won't in a shiny watch so other won't see their fore and so I'll don't know woo hand shaking. You just keep moving forward. The road shows up after you've walked it a while. Abby looked down at her bare ankles, gray with dust but moving. She didn't have a watch and her hat was gone, but her hands weren't shaking anymore. By noon the next day, Midnight was limping. A sharp shard of flint had wedged itself in the soft frog of her left forehoof. Silas spent an hour by the side of the trail with his pocket knife, his face dark with worry. But the hoof was hot to the touch. The mare wouldn't put her weight down, her black head bobbing with every step. "We have to stop," Silas said. He looked toward the north, where a cluster of low adobe roofs rose out of the sand like old teeth. "That's Red Rock ahead. It's an old freighter town. Their blacksmith named Cole if haven't drunk us to death yet." "Is it safe?" Abby asked. "Now where's safe with a lame horse?" Silas said. "Out here, an animal's legs are your life. You don't skimp on them. And you don't rush them. If you ruin a horse out of pride, the desert will harvest you before the week is out." They walked into Red Rock at 3 o'clock. The town was nothing but a single wide street of packed dirt, 4 saloons, and a long wooden boarding house with a sagging porch. Silas didn't look at the people watching from the shade of the awnings. He led Midnight straight to the livery stable at the end of the road. He paid the boy 2 silver pieces, the last of his Cimarron coin, and told him to bring water and linseed oil. Then he walked Abby over to the boarding house. He spoke to the woman behind the counter, a tall, gray-haired widow named Martha, who wore an apron made of heavy blue ticking. "2 rooms," Silas said, dropping 2 more coins onto the grease-stained ledger. "Separate. One for the lady, one for me." Martha looked at Silas' low-slung gun. She looked at Abby's torn lace and her bare, dusty shins. She didn't ask for names. People in Red Rock didn't ask for names unless they were serving a warrant. "Dinner at 6, Martha said, handing over 2 iron keys. "Don't bring your boots into the parlor, and don't bleed on the sheets." Abby's room was small. It smelled of yellow soap and dry cedar. There was a real bed with a patchwork quilt, a white porcelain pitcher, and a basin of clear water. She stood before the basin for a long. She took a cloth and wiped the gray sottes. She looked at herself in the small square mirror on the wall. Her cheeks were brown to see the side, but her eyes looked larger than they had in Dusk Creek. They looked they had seen this help. At 5, she went down to fetch from the Kelatown. In her father's studio, an idle girl was in the kitchen to the devil. At the fat the iron stove, comwadal salt pork, shifting king heavy iron pots filled with pinto beans and salt pork. She looked like a salt pork. She didn't peel the potatoes. I came to a wooden head, pointing to a wooden bucket in the corner. Martha stopped her wooden spoon. She looked at Abby's hands. "You're a preacher's girl. You got that look. Like you're waiting for to stall at her deal or deal and preach for a," said. Abby sat down on a low stool. "I'm just Abigail." Martha let out a sharp snort. A snort. "Good for you," she said, turning back to her pots. "I had a man who told me what to think for 15 years. He was a deacon at the Methodist Church back in Missouri. He died of the cholera in '72. I cried for a whole week after we put him in the clay, not for him, mind you, but because I realized I didn't know how to choose my own breakfast without asking his leave first." Abby cut a thick brown peel away. "Did you learn?" "I'm still learning," Martha said. Her voice was loud over the sizzle of the lard. "But I started. That's the part that trips people up, Abigail. They think freedom is a big speech or a brass band. It ain't. It's just deciding what you're going to do with your own 2 hands when the sun comes up, and not asking no man for permission to do it." After the supper dishes were washed, Abby walked me out to the stables. The air was cool now, the stars coming out over ridges like salt spilled on black velvet. She found Silas in the back stall. A single lantern hung from a beam, casting long, dancing shadows across the straw. Silas was on his knees in the dirt, his shoulder pressed against Midnight's flank. He would hold her lame hairs, glean salve into heel with his bare fingers. His movements were slow, steady, and incredible full. The Martis at move. She kept her muzzle close to his neck, her breathness soft against his hair. And she had rolled us to eat his hair. Stood at the gate horses. She had seen the grooms at Boone's store. They used whips and iron spurs. He had heavy iron spurs to make the animal mind. They thought obedience was something you beat into beast until it broke. He talked to the horse in a low, rhythmic murmur that sounded like water run over gravel. "She was a gift," Silas said without looking up. He knew Abby was there before it hit the straws. "From the only current or avots wanderous property." "Who was he for became our obscure?" "Old man named Hector's," said. He wiped his greasy hands a piece of on a burlap. "A rancher up near Cimarron. Was hungry and my boots were full of holes. He didn't ask way pray, but he didn't air I came from. He gate on han hosty. When he did make he hon Darren, he left me the mare. Said she was the only thing he owned that wasn't mortgaged to the credits. His joints pop into quite a barn. He put his cardade way to fights the quiner eyes. She's all our tarts, also car yards said. He's all the family guys. Then Abby looked at Brackhorse. Then at May I at the barn. The blacksmith said she needs 3 days before she can carry weight, she said. The news travels fast, Silas. Logan Vance's men will be here by tomorrow if they're following the trail. Silas reached for his gun belt, which hung from a wooden peg. He buckled it on, his fingers moving with a cold precision. Then we leave tonight, on foot. We can lead her slow through the rocks. No, Abby said. Her voice was firm. He looked at her through the yellow lance buckle. What did you say? We stay until she's ready. She walked in salt and stibador star. What in the stall? Deimba chopat sod samara seat styles her he. She were afraid of some men with silver badges. Will Silas ain't her face? I looked at the straight bar chin, the Silas study face, Sals the brown cheeks, and the steady way Simoples hot Silas at hot Kate. The preacher's din in the was something different. Something stronger. That could cost Abby, he said. Then we pay the cost, she said. That's what you told me. You don't skimp on the legs. Silas looked at her for a long second. Silas straw on foots, the bullet almost like a smile. They will go with his gun belt Lanalas at Olofskot. All right, he said. We stay. Get some grass from the bin, Abigail. The mare likes the green stuff from the bottom. The rain came to Red Rock around midnight. It didn't fall soft. It hit the tin roof of the boarding house like bagfuls of gravel, washing the red silt down the window panes until the world outside was nothing but a gray smear. Abby couldn't sleep. The bed was too soft, the sheets too clean. For 5 days her ribs had been used to the hard rim of a limestone ledge, and her ears had grown accustomed to the wide, empty whistle of the draw. She rolled out from under the quilt, her bare feet finding the cool pine floorboards. She didn't put on the ruined lace dress. Martha had left an old flannel work shirt and a wool skirt on the chair, plain clothes, faded by the lie but thick enough to keep out the chill. She found Silas on the back porch of the kitchen, sitting on a turned-over lard tub. He was watching the water run off the eaves, his thumb slowly tracing the brass frame of his pocket knife. He had a tin mug of chicory coffee between his boots. The steam smelled bitter. Abby sat down on the top step, pulling the wool skirt around her shins. Midnight stall be so easy, she said in the dark. I checked the stall before the heavy water started. She's standing on all 4 legs now. Silas didn't turn his head. He just nodded, his eyes locked on the gray sheet of rain. A horse knows when the weather changes, he said. They don't fret as it comes and save their whet as it comes and save their fat for the long pulls. The men are the only fools for trop. They sat in the fire 10 minutes. The rain had it 3 sharps, then heavy sklocktonator a spluck an old clock about the manager, Abby said. Her voice was low, pitched beneath the rumble of the thunder. The one in Cimarron. The man who wrote the contract for Hector Slayrout. The one in Cimarron. The Bordeldoam. Connaughton took a small sip. Silan picked up a slow breath. His name was Molotowd. Wore a silk vest and had hands like lard. Never roped a calf in his life, but he knew how to use a steel pen to take a man's well right out from under his fence. My father had a pen like that, Abby said. He used it to sign the church rolls. If a man didn't give his tithe by the first frost, his name came off the ledger. My father told them that God didn't keep no books for debtors. Silas turned his pocket knife over in his palm. That ain't God's book, Abby? That's just a man trying to make his neighbors small so he can feel tall in the pulpit. Miller was the same way. He told Hector that the bank was just following the territory rules. He said the rules were there to bring the railroad in, to make the country civilized. He spat over the railing into the muddy yard. I went to see Miller the morning after they put Hector in the dirt wagon, Silas continued. His voice was flat, carrying that steady, heavy pulse. I didn't bring an iron. I just asked him if he knew that Hector's grandfather died at Saratoga to give folks a piece of ground they could call their own. You know what Miller did? No, Abby whispered. He laughed, Silas said. He told me that old wars didn't pay the interest on British bonds. He said a man without a receipt didn't have no rights in a court of law. He told me that the law was a machine, and if a man was too ignorant to see the cogs, he shouldn't be surprised when his fingers got caught. Silas stood up, his boots clicking on the wet cedar planks. He walked to the edge of the porch, letting the spray hit his face. That's when I decided to break the machine, he said. I went into that vault because those 12 families didn't have no voice that a judge would listen to. The manager had the papers, he had the sheriff, and he had the state militia if he needed them. All those people had was their bare hands and the dirt they'd cleared with their own sweat. He turned around, his gray eyes catching the dim yellow light from the kitchen window. "The law is a tool, Abby," Silas said. He spoke each word clear, like it was hammering iron. "And like any tool, it depends on who's holding the handle. If a man use a spade to dig a well for his neighbors, that's one thing. If he use it to hit a blind man over the head and take his boots, that's another. I took that gold because it was the only way to balance the scale. It wasn't legal, but it was right. There is a vast piece of country between those two words. And most honest men spend their whole lives walking in it." Abby looked down at her small hands, tucked in the sleeves of the oversized flannel shirt. "My father said that if we don't obey every line, the wilderness wins. He said the law is what keeps us from being like the beasts." "Your father's got it backward," Abby said, her voice find its own weight now. "The beasts don't take more than they can eat, Silas. Midnight don't cache grass in a cave while the other horses starve on the hill. It takes a man with a silk vest and a ledger to do a thing like that. It takes a man who thinks his neighbor's life is something he can buy and sell, if the ink is dark enough." Silas watched her for a long second. The rain was beginning to slacken, the heavy thrum turning in a steady gray drizzle that made the mesquite smell like old tea. "You're growing up fast, Abigail," he said. "The trail's steep," she said, looking out toward the dark ridges. "A person don't have much time to stay small when the water's rising." Silas didn't answer, but he didn't go back inside either. He sat back down on the lard tub, picked up his cold mug, and stayed right there beside her until the eastern sky turned the color of an old iron kettle. They left Red Rock before the noon stage arrived. Midnight's hoof was clean, the split held fast by coal as heavy tallow. Iron and 3 days of rest. She didn't hobble. She walked with her nose low, her black coat steaming in the damp heat that rose from the wet sand. The country changed 5 miles out. The red rocks gave way to gray limestone hills, cut deep by old watercourses that had been dry since the Spaniards came. Around 3 o'clock they hit a small goat ranch near the San Pedro draw. It wasn't much more than a stone corral, a brush jackal, and a wind pump that groaned every time the wheel turned. An old man with a beard like sheepish wool was sitting on a cedar fence post, mending a rawhide halter. His name was Caleb. He had lived in the territory since the days of the Mexican War. Caleb looked at Midnight, then he looked at Abby's flannel shirt. He didn't get down from his post. He just pointed a greasy finger toward the water trough. His voice sounded like two dry stone rubbing together. "Help your elves, but keep eye on the ridge. But your scientists. There's 4 I'd been circling the since yestermorning. Therefore I've been circling the droughts I dress," they said. Aki's froze, her hand stopping on Zidnate's mane. Silas walked her to the well frame, his near his hip, his hand loose near his hip. "Who was leading them, old man?" "Logan Vance," Caleb said. "He didn't look up from rawhide, had that silver, horned saddle of his. He stopped here yesterday noon, drank 3 cups of my goat milk and told me that Pastor Vance had offered 50 silver pieces for his daughter return. Said the girl was simple-minded, lost her wits after her groom jilted her." Abby felt a hot flush of anger rise in her neck, burning away the cold fear. "I am not simple-minded," she said, her voice ringing clear against the stone coral. Caleb looked up then. His old eyes were milky, but they were sharp enough to see the way she held her shoulders. He let out a dry cackle. "Didn't think you were, child," Caleb said. "A simple girl don't walk 50 miles through the chaparral with an outlaw and keep her skin. Your daddy's a good preacher, I reckon, but he's a hard man with a debt. Everyone in the valley knows about the Boone note." Abby stepped closer to the fence. The smell of the sheep manure was thick in the heat. "What note, Caleb? Tell me." Caleb sighed, dropping the halter into the dirt between his boots. 3 years ago," he said, looking at the gray hills. "Mother was sick with that lung fever. The doctor out of Silversbury wanted $4 for bring the Patiswa. Stage hork 20 more gradle weekading. You that Abby. Hike hikes to us break saddy." He looked at old face showing a brief snibber. He looked at Abby. "Boone gave him the way, but he do it out of Christian charity. But he didn't do it out of Christ charity. He didn't your daddy sign a paper, a mortgage on that little piece of church land, and a promise that when you turn 18, you take Boone's name. Boone wanted the land for his warehouse. And he wanted a preacher's daughter to give him some respect in the town after he got caught cheating the railroad freighters." The wind pump gave a long, rusty shriek above them. It sounded like an animal caught in a trap. Abby felt the ground tilt beneath her boots. She reached out and caught the top rail of the cedar fence to keep from dropping. "He sold me," she whispered. "Haste me 3 years ago to pay for the medicine." "He was desperate, child," Caleb said softly. A desperate man don't see the lines on the page. He just sees the thing he bout to lose. He loved your mother, I reckon. He had that debt hanging over his head like an axe. If you didn't marry Boone, Boone was going to take the parsonage and tell the bishop about the money. Your dowdy didn't seem cuts tree. He had a choice, Silas said from the well. His voice was cold, old and sharp as a butcher's knife. He could his dan axe and cut cordwood, oak till his back to pay that debt. He could have slept in the brush like Hector did. He had a choice to carry his own load, old man. Instead, he put it on her back because she was too small to throw it off. Silas walked over and stood right beside Abby. He didn't touch her, but his shadow fell over her like a wall, blocking out the glare of the noon sun. A man who uses his own child to clear his ledger ain't a father, said to Caleb. He is just a merchant who deals in flesh instead of dry goods. The church can call him a saint if they want to, but the dirt out here knows better. Caleb didn't argue. He just picked up his rawhide halter and went back to his stitching, his head low. They walked away from the goat ranch in silence. The sun was going down now, casting long blue shadows across the limestone washes. Abby led Midnight, her fingers buried deep in the black hair of the mare's neck. She didn't cry. The tears were gone, dried up by the truth Caleb had left in the dirt. They camped in a narrow crevice between two limestone boulders that looked like two old teeth. Silas didn't build a fire tonight. It was too close to the ridge where Logan S. men were riding. They sat in the dark, eating their dry beef in the cold wind. Is it possible, Abby asked after the stars had come out. Her voice was very small, to love someone and still use them like a mule. Silas stayed quiet for a long time. She could hear him shifting his gun belt against the rock. Yes, Silas said. People do it all the time, Abby, usually without knowing they're doing it. They get scared. Or they see the bank to see with fight backs and grab the nearest thing that can't fight back. They tell them they're doing it for family, or they're doing it for God. But they're just doing it because they're afraid of being cold. They just doing her head back against the limestone. It was hard and unshielding. Arnolfi didn't want to go in that church. He knew I didn't want to go in that church. He knew. Silas said. Silas said. Then what do I do with that? She asked the dark. How do I carry that back to the town? Silas moved then. His boot shifted in the gravel, and she felt his shoulder brush against hers. He didn't put his arm around her. He wasn't that kind of man, but he stayed close enough that she could feel the heat of his skin through the flannel shirt. You don't carry it back, Silas said. His voice had that low, rhythmic murmur he used for the mare when her leg was hot. Some things are too heavy to put in a saddlebag, Abby. You just leave them right here in the rocks. You let the wind chew on them until the rest ain't left but the bone. My mother left when I was 7 years old. Abby turned her head in the dark. She left? Yeah, Silas said. Took the stage to St. Louis with a horse, trader from Illinois. Left me sitting on a grain sack behind the livery stable. I spent 5 years being so angry I couldn't chew my bread. Then I spent another 5 years making up stories about how she must have been crazy or how the trader must have forced her. He paused, the wind whistling sharp through the limestone crack. Tired of carrying her ghost around every time I crossed a creek. Now she just some who couldn't stay. She wasn't strong enough for the wind out here. And that's her business, not mine. Your father's son who couldn't carry his own weight. He's just Anne, who couldn't carry his own weights. You sector got your own ace now with balls, you'll get all in exhaust. Abby didn't say anything else. She let her head drop sideways until it rested against his shoulder. Silas went very still. For 3 long seconds his breath stopped in his chest. Then he let it out, a slow, deep sigh that smelled of old tobacco and wild sage, and he didn't move away. They sat there together in the cold, dark canyon, two people who had been sold by the world, learning how to count their own coin. The town of Las Piedras was too large, to be honest. It sat in a wide, muddy bend of the Rio Grande, boasting 3 separate brick buildings, a railroad spur that smelled of creosote, and a courthouse with a tin dome that glared like a new dollar in the noon heat. People here didn't walk. They hurried. They had papers in their pockets and clocks on their walls. Silas didn't like it. He kept his hat pulled down until his chin nearly touched his collar, leading Midnight straight through the alleyways behind the freight yards. I got an old matter to settle with a blacksmith named Vance on the north side, Silas said, stopping in the shade of a long adobe wool warehouse. It's not your people, just a man who owes me a favor from the Lincoln County days. You stay out of the street. This town's full of deputies who sell their own mothers for the price of a round of drinks. Abby looked down the main street. The heat was rising from the wooden boardwalks in wavy lines. There is a library across from the liveries, a small voice quiet but firm, a small room with glass windows. I haven't seen a book since dusk creaked. Sila, seeked her. Her face Silas. The skin around her face was brown now, the skin around her eyes, crinked 3 weeks of squinting in the glare. She didn't look a wrister to ain about her. She looked like a woman who knew the weight of her own boots. Go on then, Silas said, handing her a silver dime. Buy a ginger cake if they've got them, but if a man asks your names, you tell him you're Martha S. girl from Red Rock. You don't use the Vance name in a place with a telegraph wire. The library wasn't much. It was just a corner room inside the county recorder's office, smelling of wet ink, old sheepskin ledgers, and dust that had been brought in from Missouri 20 years ago. An old man with steel-rimmed spectacles and a coat that was too large for his shoulders sat behind an oak desk. His name was Mr. Bennett, and his were permanently stained purple sewn. Abby walked along the low shelves, her fingers brushing the cloth spines. Her fingers brushing spines. Her flannel shirt was clean, but her skirt was stiff with the gray mud of the San Pedro draw. Bennett looked up over his spectacles. He didn't look at her clothes. He looked at the way she hands volumes. He knew a reader when he saw. You're looking at when he saw one. Yaw for the script, miss. He knew when he saw one. His voice was thin like old parchment. No, Abby said, stopping before a shelf of legal registers. I had enough scripture to lastling cough that might us luck an uckle. I am just looking at the country. Mr. Bennett let out a dry and long child. If you're looking most beyond in lawsuits. Country for Kane, also in the wrong shop, paused. His purple truth, you're in on's desk. The heavy Silas warning. What did you say your name was? Abby remembered. She looked at the glass window where the tin dome of the courthouse was burning in the sun. Then she looked back at the old clerk. Abigail Ann, she said. From the north draw. Mr. Bennett adjusted his glasses. He pulled a yellowed sheet of paper from the binder. It was covered in a shaky, elegant handwriting, the kind of script women used to write in Virginia before the war. Ann, he muttered. I've had a notice here for 3 years from a lawyer down in Tucson, looking for an Abigail Ann Morrow, or Vance. Her mother was a Parrish. Abby felt her breath catch in her throat. Her mother's name had been Sarah Parrish. My grandmother was Ruth Ann Parrish, she said. Her voice didn't rise, but it had that steady, heavy pulse she had learned from the limestone trail. Mr. Bennett looked at her for a long second, then he pushed the paper across the desk. Ruth Ann Parrish died in 75, the old man said. She left a will, registered with the territorial court in Prescott. She didn't have much. Just a 3-room adobe cabin in 8 acres of grass near the Mule Mountains in Arizona Territory, and $340 in gold held in trust by the Territory Treasury. Abby stared at the shaky ink. Her grandmother's hand had been old, the letters tilting like wild grass in a gale. At the bottom, clear as a bell, were the words, "To my granddaughter Abby, so she may always have a choice." My father, Abby whispered, her knuckles going white against the oak desk. He knew. He must have known. A girl's father is her legal guardian until she's 18 or married, Mr. Bennett said. He spoke each word clear without any feeling like he was reading an entry in a stray list. The law says he has the right to manage the estate. He don't have to tell the child nothing if he thinks it'll make her headstrong. Most men think a girl with 80 acres of grass is a girl who won't mind her elders. Abby didn't look down. She looked right at the old clerk's purple fingers. The law is a cage, then, she said. No, Mr. Bennett said, his voice dropping an octave. The law is just an engine, miss. It don't care who it runs over unless someone puts a brake on the wheels. Your grandmother knew that she put the clause in. The paper says if you reach your 18th year without taking a husband, the land is yours in your own name. No guardian, no husband. He dipped a steel pen in his inkwell and pushed a large letter toward her. Mr. Belnair, 6th of May, Mr. Bennett said. According to the registry from Dusk Creek, you turned registry from Dusk Creek. You signed 3 weeks ago. The land's register Abiel. The land is registered to you. The gold will be sent the staged treasury to the land office in Son. Your father can't touch it. Boone can't touch it. It's your own piece of ground. Abby took the pen. The metal was cold against her skin. She didn't ask Silas, and she didn't pray to her father's God. She just wrote her name, Abigail Ann Vance, clear and dark across the white page. She met Silas by the freight yards. An hour later, she held the legal certificate wrapped in a piece of brown butcher's paper. Her face was very quiet. Silas at the paper, then at her eyes. You look like you've seen a ghost, Abby. I saw my grandmother, she said. She handed him the page. He read it, thumb tracing the blue seal of the territory. Silas said. His voice was duller. His voice low. 8 acres of grass. That ain't a key, Abby. And the hard Sibrakan Mesquat, the water 6 feet down if you're lucky. It's my name on the deed. It's mine, she said. It's my own name on the deed. My that because he wanted me to think I's a big rar. A father hidik. It why get a wood dwar the ditch. They wakated maraboon I de star in the skis. Silas gave the paper back. But horse war a person who all on dirt don't have to beg no for a rise, to beg no man for a roof, Silas said. He spoke with that steady rhythmic beat, that S what the big cattlemen know Abby, that S why they hire men with guns to drive the nesters off the creeks. True freedom ain't something that lives in your mind. It's something you can put a fence around. If you don't own your own bread, your soul belongs to the man who owns the bakery. They spent the night in abandoned sheep, camped 3 miles down. River. The willow brush was thick, keeping out the lights of the town. Abby lay under her blanket, looking at the stars through the holes in the roof. Silas sat by the door, his silhouette black against the river fog. She didn't feel like a girl running from a wedding anymore, who was just traveling her property. She reached out in the dark and touched the paper beneath her saddle blanket. It was crisp. It was real. Silas, she called soft. Yeah, came the voice from the doorway. Thank you for the horse, she said. The river fog moved through the willows, making a sound like a silk dress dragging across the floor. Silas didn't answer with words, but she heard him shift his position, his back settling flat against the adobe doorpost, keeping the watch until the morning came. The ambush happened at the dry crossing of the Picacho Wash, 20 miles west of the river. The noon sun was high and white, washing all the color out of the hills until the world looked like an old bone. Silas was leading midnight through the deep sand when 4 horses rose out of the rocks behind the cut bank. They didn't call out. They just came in a semicircle. Their carbines held loose across their pommels. In the middle rode Logan Vance. His silver, horned saddle was gray with trail dust, but his badge was bright enough to hurt the eyes. West Kansas said his voice was dry. Cracked by the ollie. Keep your hands off that walnut. There's 4 rifles on your chest, and the county don't pay for burials. Silas stopped, but his right arm went the wasplatas loose and long against his thigh. The way right arm went care to step down his shoulder that had been baked in the sun for 100 years. Abby's atst out from behind Midnight's shoulder. She wasn't wearing the white dress. She was wearing Marfois' split endell shirt and the thick wool skirt. Hey, brown paper D. She held the brown paper bundle against her ribs. Logan vamped from his whore. He didn't get down from his horse, Abigail, he said, his horse shifting in the sand. Your daddy S nearly died of the stroke. He's waiting at the station in Red Rock. You get on that buckskin bind Miller, and we forget about this thief you've been traveling with. I am not going to Red Rock, Abby said. Her voice didn't shake. It carried across the dry wash, clear as a bell ringing in an empty canyon. You've got no choice. Girl, Logan said, his hand tightening on his reins. The law says a minor belongs to her father's house. Eve got a warrant here signed by the magistrate in Dusk Creek. Abby stepped past Silas. She walked 3 paces into the open sand, right toward the muzzle of Logan's carbine. She unrolled the brown paper and held it up toward the silver, horned saddle. This a territoire deed, Abby was what Hivet Somber or Sectional Pulse. It registered yesterday morning with Mr. Bennett, Siam Piedade. It says I am 18 years of age. It says I am here. Says I am a legal landowner in the territory of Arizona. I am not a minor, Logan. I am not my father's property. I am not stirred blue security. Logan Vance looked at the blue seal on the paper. He didn't move his rifle, but his horse felt the change in his legs and gave a low blow through her nose. If you take me by force, Abby said, her voice growing harder, you are committing an assault against a citizen of legal standing. I will write to the federal marshal in Santa Fe before the sun goes down. Mr. Bennett has my signature in his ledger. You want to explain to a federal judge why you're hunting landowners for $50 silver. The 3 deputies behind Logan looked at each other. They weren't trackers. They were just town boys who worked for county for dollars a day. They didn't want no trouble with a federal judge over a parson's daughter. One of them, a boy named Miller, lowered his carbine until the butt rested on his thigh. Logan, he muttered, the paper looks legal. If she's of age, the warrant ain't worth the ink. Logan Vance's face turned the color of an old beet. He looked at Silas. Then he looked at Abby standing straight in the sand. He knew the frontier was changing. The old days where a man with a badge could do what he liked in the draws were going out with the railroad track. "You're a fool, Abigail," Logan said, pulling his buckskin around until the bit keys jangled. "You'll star condas when the wit your gra. Donas creed is kind me." "Doas," he said. They rode off, their horses of at a halt make a doas tud in the deep sand awash, her till the brush the them until the first swallowed bobbin. The slagging the friction. The less shaking now. Her hand was shaking now. The paper over and took her elbow. Hand steady on warm to flannelable. "Where'd that come from, Abby?" He has steady. The duskry and warm through flannel. His voice was very quiet. "I don't know," she said, and down at her split boots. "Ike, it's been there whole time, Silas. I think it's my mother's house in my grandbellis letters. I just never had a reason to use it until today." They reached the Alps of Santa Sate. 2 day old. The city hours gray that had turned the color of the hills. They could taught it sort of Arctic house on color of the hills with cottonwood hill that thick and green along the water ditches. They stopped at the edge of the plaza, beneath the shade of a great tree. Silas dismounted and began to unbuckle his saddlebags. He didn't look at her face. "What are you doing?" Abby asked, her hand stopping on Midnight's neck. "I'm going into that brick building across the square," Silas said. He pointed toward a double door where a flag with blue stars was hanging loose in the heat. "That's the U.S. Marshal S office. Judge Harlan inside. He's an old school man, but he's fair." Abby felt her heart go tight again. "You're turning yourself in." "Yeah," Silas said. He buckled his bags over his shoulder. "As long as that bounty's on my head, Abby, I'm just a wolf in the brush. I can't buy wire for your fence, and I can't help you plow the garden without looking over my shoulder every time a dog barks. I took that money in Cimarron for the right reasons, but it's still a debt I owe to the country. A man can't build nothing permanent if he's running from his own ledger. They'll put you in prison," she said. Her voice was small now, like the girl who had sat in the dirt behind the church. Maybe he reached out and took her hand. His skin was rough, but his fingers held hers tight. "But Judge Harlan listens to the circumstances. I've got letters from those 12 families in my pocket. They wrote them last winter when the snow was heavy. If I go in on my own feet, it looks different than if Tucker drags me in across a pack saddle." He looked at the black mare. Then he put the reins into Abby's palm. "Take Midnight," he said. "Start fence, Abby. Don't you wait for me out of any promise. You're a free woman out of any promise. You're a free woman now. You live for yours. I am not waiting out of a promise head. Hewa you chin to stay until lay with his. I am choosing to stay until the ledger clears. Belize's not ready to stop knowing you, Silas Weston." Silas didn't answer with words. He just looked at her face for one long, deep second, as if he was memorizing the shape of her mouth and the brown of her cheeks. Then he turned around, walked across the plaza through the blinding white dust, and pushed open the heavy double doors of the marshal's office without looking back. Abby stood beneath the cottonwood tree, holding the reins of the black horse. The sun was hot, and the city was full of strangers, but she didn't feel lonely. She sat down on the stone bench, pulled her grandmother's deed out from her shirt, and began to wait in the daylight. The wind in the Mule Mountains didn't blow from the north or the south. It came right down from the jagged limestone peaks, smelling of sun, baked flint in the dry, sweet brush the Mexicans called creosote. 14 months is a long time if you're counting the days by the water in a cedar bucket. If you're trying to clear 80 acres of scray mesquite with nothing but a mule, a logging chain, and your own 2 hands. Abigail Vance stood on the porch of the small adobe cabin. The mud walls were thick 2 feet of packed revar, silt and straw, baked hard by the Arizona sun. It wasn't flat like the houses in Dusk Creek. It didn't have a white spire or a green gate. It just grew out of the earth, looking like a boulder that had decided to stay. Her hands were different now. The white skin her mother had guarded with bonnet strings was gone, replaced by a deep dark brown that matched the cedar post of her coral. Her palms were calloused along the base of the fingers, the hard ridge that comes from swing a grubbing, hoe against roots that didn't want to leave the clay. She walked out to the fence line on the east side of the draw. A dozen children were sitting on unpeeled pine logs beneath the shade of brush ramada. They were rare old children boys with patched knees whose fathers worked the layout crews for the Southern Pacific, 2 little girls from an Apache camp down river, and 3 Mexican boys whose boots were held together with buckskin string. They didn't have a schoolhouse in the valley. The territory didn't spend its tax money on kids whose parents lived in tents. Abby stood before a large slab of slate she had salvaged from a ruined freight wagon. She held a piece of white limestone between her fingers. "The letters don't belong to Governor," Abby said to children. Her voice was steady, that conversion to marshals, and they don't belong to the marshals. A man who can't read a contract is a man who's walking through the brush without a lantern. If you don't know what the words say, any clerk with a steel pen take your well right out from under your horse's feet. We're going to read the third line today. The oldest boy, a lanky lad named Billy, whose father had lost 2 fingers to black powder blast, looked up from his slate. "My daddy says the law is on for the folks in the brick houses, Miss Abby." "Your daddy's half right, Billy," Abby said. She turned and wrote the word D across the stone in large, block letters. "The law is a tool that was built by folks who know how to use the alphabet. If you don't know the letters, the tool belongs to the other man. But once you can read the page yourself, you've got the same weight in a courtroom as the president of the bank. The alphabet is where the fence starts." She kept them at it until 4 o'clock, when the sun dropped below the rim of the canyon and the shadows turned the color of wild plums. The children ran off down the draw, their small feet kicking up puffs of red dust that hung in the quiet air. Ab walked to the corral. Midnight was standing by the top rail. The black mare had grown thick in the flank from the grama grass, her coat shining like greased iron in the evening light. She didn't bite anymore. She just put her nose down in Abby's palm, looking for the dried apple peels kept in her apron pocket. Martha had come down from Red Rock 2 months ago on the freight stage. She had brought a crate of stone jars, 3 blankets, and a bundle of letters that had been held at the Las Piedras office. One of the letters was from Dusk Creek. The envelope was cheap, the paper turning yellow along the margins. The ink was shaky, the handwriting of an old man whose fingers had begun to forget the grip of the pen. Pastor Vance didn't ask for her forgiveness. He didn't use the words sin or repentance. He just wrote about the weather, about how the well at the parsonage had gone bitter in the drought, and how Thaddeus Boone had lost his warehouse to the territorial tax collector. At the bottom of the last page he had written, "I see you now, Abigail, the person you are. I am sorry I couldn't see her before the church doors closed." Abby didn't burn the letter. She didn't cry over it either. She just folded it 4 times and put it in the pine drawer with her grandmother's deed. It was just an old ledger that had been balanced too late to change the price of the goods. Anger was just another thing that took space in a saddlebag. The sound of flour and seed, the sound of iron on flint from mouth for flour and seed. The sound of iron on flint came the mouth of a tree. She didn't prick her black ears first. She didn't blow or stomp. She chaded Blaslanox where the trail came down from the north. She stayed by the corral rail. On resting on the rail, her hand on the mare's shoal, hid the shadow on the monster, the crew for froze. A man was riding a buckskin gelding, a plain animal with a trail brand on its hip. He wore old denim shirt that had been washed the gold riscassi, and his hat brim was pulled low to block the glare of the setting sun. His gun belt was buckled on, but the holster was worn at the bottom where the iron had rubbed through the leather during a long ride. Silas Weston pulled the gelding to a stop 10 paces from the porch. He didn't look like an hung hero. He looked thin, his cheekbones sharp beneath his brown skin, and his hair was graying a little around the ears where the hatband pressed. He looked at the adobe cabin. He looked at the slate board by the ramada, and then he looked at Abby. His gray eyes were clear now. They didn't have that wolf look she had seen when he rode out of the brush behind the Dusk Creek church. "The judge called extraordinary circumstances," Silas said. His voice was low, carrying that old gravel rattle she knew better than her own prayers. 12 families came to Santa Fe on the night train. They sat in the back row with their hats in their laps. Old man Hector's nephew brought the original lease, the one with the grease stains from oil lamp. Judge Harlan looked at the ledger for 20 minutes. Then he told the prosecutor that the territory didn't have enough lumber to build a gallows for an honest thief. Abby nodded slowly. "I was there for first hearing. I sat in the thirds behind the rail. You didn't see me." "You didn't seen. Why didn't you call Al?" "You were busy being honest with the room," she said. "I didn't want you forming for a girl in a flannel shirt." Silent at short, dry stone of raw odd, found again in the Santa jail. He swung his leg over the pommel and dropped down drawn in the dust. His boots the earth with that solid, familiar thud. He walked over Tom Midnight. The mare didn't draw back. She gave a low, wet blow its shoulder. "Quad mal find the pockets to cat his harder." Sais Hoffot to keep his taku, so was farfig against Fida's cheek, eyes crossed for 3 long seconds. It was a private thing. Hekavasaktled flatsaget a watermole squint clots kether, when the water was locked hot about low. Then he looked over the horse's mane at Abby. "You built all this," he said, pointing his gloved hand toward the adobe walls and the cleared field where the green corn shoots were coming through the red loam. "I am still building," she said. Silas shifted his weight, his fingers touching the brass buckle of his gun belt. He didn't offer her a promise, and he didn't give her a speech about the future. He just looked at the hills where the night was coming down, dark and blue and full of room. "There's a fence on the east side that keeps falling down," Abby said in the quiet. "The limestone's loose underneath. It needs a dead man anchor dug 3 feet in the gravel." Silas looked at her. The hard lines around his mouth gave way, his eyes softening until they looked the river pools after the rain has passed. "I know how to fix fences, Abigail," he said. Abby reached out and took the buckskin reins from his hand. She didn't ask his leave, and she didn't look back to see if the church doors were open. Her grandmother had written the lines on the yellowed paper, so she may always have a choice, and there on her own dirt, under a sky that had no walls and no masters. Abigail Ann Vance looked at the man had given her a horse, and she finally chose. This book is a work of imagination. Names, characters, places, and incidents either are products of the author's creativity or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is unintentional and should not be construed as factual representation.
When the sun sets over the Mule Mountains and Abigail Ann Vance stands on her own land, this story leaves us with one powerful truth. Freedom is not given to a person simply because the world says they are grown. Freedom begins the moment a soul learns to choose for itself. Abigail started this journey in a wedding dress she never wanted, standing like a possession waiting to be handed from one man's ledger to another. Her father called it duty. Boone called it security. The town called it proper. But out on the open trail, beneath a sky with no church walls and no master's hand on her elbow, Abigail discovered the voice that had been buried inside her all along. She learned that obedience without dignity is not virtue, and love without respect can become another kind of cage. Silas Weston, the outlaw with a price on his head, teaches us that a man's worth is not always written correctly by the law. Sometimes the law protects the rich while punishing the righteous. Sometimes the man called a thief is the only one brave enough to return stolen bread to hungry families. Silas is not perfect, but he is honest in the places that matter. He gives Abigail a horse, not to own her path, but to help her begin it. He walks beside her without demanding her gratitude, protects her without claiming her life, and finally turns himself in because he understands that no home can be built while a man is still running from his own unfinished truth. Through Abigail's grandmother's deed, the story reminds us that property, education, and a name of one's own can become shields against a world that tries to reduce the powerless to signatures on a page. A woman who can read the paper, understand the trap, and sign her own name is no longer easy to sell, silence, or frighten. And perhaps the deepest lesson is this: healing does not always mean returning to the people who hurt us. Sometimes healing means leaving their burdens in the dust, carrying only what gives life, and making peace without surrendering our freedom. Abigail does not become strong because the trail is kind to her. She becomes strong because the trail is hard, honest, and wide enough to show her who she truly is. By the end, she is no longer a runaway bride, no longer a preacher's daughter, no longer a debt to be paid. She is a landowner, a teacher, a woman with calloused hands and clear eyes, building a future from the dirt beneath her own boots. And that is the heart of this story. No matter how long someone has lived inside another person's plans, there comes a day when the gate opens, the horse is waiting, and the road ahead belongs to them.